Triturnian, a mix-and-match group of indie developers, has brought us their first title, Mordhau, a multiplayer medieval hack-and-slash. Released April of 2019, it had a Kickstarter project that covered most of what they were going for, and ultimately had a lot more success in terms of sales than they were anticipating. To the point of suffering a fair few issues on release, like experience not tracking properly and connectivity problems. Since then, it's been mostly stable, and they've reimbursed players for any time lost. As an action game, it has a complex combat system that draws at least some influence from historical fighting techniques. The direction of attacks are determined by an indicator that hovers around the crosshair, which you can move around using the mouse in up to 240 degrees, with the option of slashing, chopping, and thrusting, giving plenty of options to use what's suitable for the situation. Trying to swing your weapon side to side in a tight tunnel or when surrounded by teammates isn't going to help you make any friends since there's physics tied to them, so you'll end up interrupting yourself. You can parry by facing an incoming blow and blocking before being struck, feint by starting an attack and then cancelling it, or morph it by beginning one type before quickly starting another, all to help catch opponents off guard and bait them into parrying prematurely. There's also the advanced technique of chambering, wherein you mirror an opponent with a slight delay of your own attack in order to block theirs and follow through. Only heater and kiter shields have the option of actually blocking for realsies, and can prove a bit of a pain tackling early on, until you realize they have proper hitboxes, and as such you can swing around them or just attack repeatedly until they're disarmed. You could opt for kicking them if you can get it to work, since sometimes it'll just straight up refuse. When it does feel like cooperating, it can be so slow and short reach that the shield user just backs away while you whiff and end up looking like a complete bellend. It is pretty funny that you can kick doors open, which will knock enemies on their ass. I do enjoy the small details, like the ability to pull ranged weapons out of your body or off of someone else's and having it added to your inventory. You can pinch throwable weapons off of enemies in the same way too. Missing your swings, jumping, blocking, feinting, and parrying incorrectly will lead to draining your stamina, which means you're going to end up getting disarmed or knocked over once it's fully depleted. This helps prevent issues like mindlessly flailing around or endlessly faking people out hoping they'll fall for it. Health and stamina both recover after a short break of not doing anything strenuous, like engaging in combat or sprinting. You get a small chunk of health back for killing enemies in melee too, which helps incentivize keeping the battle going rather than pussing out every time you get knocked upside the head. All these mechanics encourage more thoughtful play akin to traditional fighting games. In addition to this, you can kit yourself out with different perks that'll help tailor your playstyle. Bonuses, like making enemies drop all their weapons upon death, prolonging your life after a lethal blow for a couple of seconds to take revenge, or taking less fire or fall damage. Which, I have to say, is always tempting, given just how punishing falling any kind of distance can be. You're also capable to ride horses around and set polearms for some proper jousting, which is rather enjoyable. It feels great galloping through skirmishes and skewering enemies that are unfortunate enough to get in your way. They handle fairly well, although tend to suffer issues like stopping when brushing up against just about any piece of terrain, or your horse getting stuck and taking a million years to get going again. Players who go about swinging willy-nilly are going to end up hitting their own horse by mistake if they're not careful, or if it rears up in an inopportune moment as well, so that's something to keep in mind. The tutorial does a pretty good job of covering these subjects, showing you how to perform all the techniques, including turning your body to help augment the timing of your attacks, on top of repairing items and operating siege equipment. Plus, it doesn't take itself too grimdark super seriously, including a bit of humor to help lighten things up, which coincides with the rest of the cheeky lines you're able to spout out during matches.
This is a real battlefield, but don't be alarmed. We're perfectly safe at the moment. Well, I suppose that moment...
Overall, the combat is fun and deep enough to be engaging, although it has quite the steep learning curve, requiring some dedicated practice to get good at. But once you manage, you'll end up feeling like an absolute god when you cleave through a bunch of people with relative ease. There seems to be just one small flaw with this system, and that being that teammates are something that exist. So you'll frequently have blokes running around trying to stab you in the arse from different directions, their mates about 50 feet back shooting you with arrows the whole time, not to mention your own teammates helping out by smacking you in the back repeatedly. Which means if any of these land a successful hit on you, you're likely to be interrupted and then permastunned until death occurs. Mind, you can escape these situations in some cases, but every now and then it's just gonna prove a small annoyance. Other than that though, the combat even in larger battles can still be really fun with just how chaotic they can get. It just makes me wish that voice chat was included, since trying to coordinate with your team is pretty much impossible. Sure, there's text chat, but let's be honest here. Nobody's gonna read what you have to say while trying to fend off half a dozen people at the same time. And more likely than not, it's just being used by people to complain about balance or someone team killing with the catapult. Again. The choice of weapons is rather good, with plenty of options to tailor to any playstyle you'd want. With all sorts of swords and things such as daggers, axes, halberds, longbows, firebombs, and loots in case you're feeling inspired to roleplay a bard rocking out some sick riffs before smacking that pleb that accosted you upside the head. Each handles somewhat realistically, doing pretty much what you'd expect against their intended target, so tackling peasants with an arming sword will do you better than trying to get busy with a guy kitted out in full plate, for instance. They each have their own pros and cons, some being short but quick, and others slow but powerful or with a lot of reach. The Maul is able to one-shot just about any opponent in the head, but it's dreadfully slow, unable to combo, and has a fair bit of downtime between swings that leaves them wide open for counters. Most come sporting an alternate weapon mode, whether it's the option of half-swording a Swyhander, switching your longsword to the titular Mordhau grip to help batter armored opponents, or tossing your short spear at some cheeky git trying to leg it. As mentioned earlier, they have physics attached to them, so you're able to actually parry or smack projectiles out of the air if you time it correctly, or if you're just lucky enough. I'm still unsure what the point of parrying shields are, since you can usually parry with the weapon you've got, and they actually tend to have worse angles you can block from. I can appreciate the variety of weapons, and they're mostly balanced, I feel, with a few exceptions. Even the stamina costs are so similar that I don't see the justification of spending 3 points on a buckler. Then there's the rapier and short spear being super cheap to equip and so fast in attacking that all you have to do is scroll wheel up and you'll more likely win the fight. Unless you get chambered, but in that case it's whoever has the most stamina wins. For the most part I'm satisfied with the weapons though, and just feel like a few of them need a small adjustment here and there and it'll be in a pretty healthy place to be. I really like the way that the bows handle. It adjusts your crosshair until you've fully drawn the string and gives you the option of firing early if you're able to line yourself up with the target before it fully settles. This, matched with the fact that it'll start to veer up into one side as your arm grows more and more tired before cancelling the shot entirely, helps to incentivize timing and some modicum of skill, instead of just holding it there hoping to bait people into making a mistake. They've included a toolbox which lets you place down a couple of different defensive obstacles to help fill in any holes that enemies may try pouring through. Whether it's palisade walls to provide handy cover for your own archers against enemy projectiles, or chevaux de frise, which are the little spikes to stop the bloody horses running amok for your team. It also works on infantry trying to parkour over it, so you should put them between crenellations to stop the Assassin's Creed wannabes from climbing over. They definitely need to do something about the bear traps though, since you could put them on top of ladders and then they have the option of either climbing up and falling to their death, or climbing back down and getting shot at all the while. Since you're unable to use your weapons from the ladder, so you can't disarm them, and then they'll just trigger the moment you get off, so it's more than just a little bit cheesy. You can also use one of the variety of hammers to repair defenses, erect the static ones strewn across the map, and also fix doorways. These, unlike the toolboxes, can also be used in combat, so you're not entirely useless when it comes to a fight. You can cycle through the different emplacements with the alternate weapon mode, and if you want to place a static ballista, you need to go refill your ammo capacity to full, by the way, since that's something they don't tell you about. I think this helps add a lot of freedom and options of countering tactics that people may try employing, although I do wish that they would add a tally showing how many of your defenses are still intact, since you can only make 6 at a time before you start destroying older ones. I've got to say that I approve the level of customization Mordhau offers. The character creator has a fair few options, but it's male only, so no medieval waifus allowed. Not yet anyway, since apparently they're working on it. The creator itself comes with sliders to adjust your character's build, and the face manipulation is like something out of Fallout 4, which is to say that you pinch parts of the face to mold it like it's made out of clay or something. Unfortunately, this means that it can be rather inaccurate when you're trying to recreate the same look, coupled with the fact that there is no option to load and save custom appearances, so if you want to make more than one mercenary to have different loadouts with, you're going to have to do them from scratch each and every time, which proves tedious. At least there's the randomize option if you don't really care and just want something that doesn't look like the default potato that they give you. But the option of saving and loading appearances seems so obvious that they should have included it from the start, to be honest. Where the customization really shines is altering the appearance of just about any weapon or armor piece you buy. Having a consistent currency system that you earn in-game for matches and first time around you complete the tutorial. This lets you buy new pieces of gear that you can equip in most game modes, although it seems a little bit buggy since there's some items that unlock for both modes and some you have to purchase separately. As a result, I'd recommend buying things for the co-op mode until you've gotten what you want in loadouts, else you'll be stuck with whatever freebies you're given to start with. The rate you gained gold originally was pretty abysmal at launch, but they've increased it since then, and I'd say it's pretty fair now. Matches feel rewarding since it'll distribute more the better you play and the longer each match lasts. If you really need the money and experience fast, then you can always just kit yourself out with nothing but firebombs and heal kits, then run around tossing them into groups of people. Then you run back to the ammo crates to refill and repeat, all the while laughing as your score keeps increasing. For most game modes, weapons, perks, and armor have an assigned point cost to them that's deducted from your total. The selection of pre-made classes are fairly good at covering the basic roles or playstyles one may want to do, and help to offer something formidable until you can get the funds to properly scrape together your own custom loadouts. Speaking of which, there's several flavors of warfare, 3 of which offered by the official matchmaking. Frontline is a back and forth tug of war wherein you secure capture points either by standing around in a field or sometimes completing certain objectives, like rescuing prisoners or carrying barrels to blow up a siege tower, all the while having ticket counters deplete until one team or the other reaches 0 and thus lose. This mode is by far the most fun, but it does suffer from that one issue I mentioned earlier where enemies will run up to try and poke you in the ankles when you're not looking. The other 2 matchmaking friendly game modes are Battle Royale and Horde, because just about every game has to have these nowadays. The former is what you'd expect. Players spawn in, run around to open up chests containing items, and battle to the death until one person's left standing. The downside, however, is that there's only 2 maps and they're both far too small for this kind of thing. Having 64 players spawning in means that more often than not you're going to start within sprinting distance of several players immediately, which means if you aren't lucky enough to spawn near a chest, you're 9 times out of 10 going to die. I spent more time waiting for matches than I spent actually getting to play them, since the small size of the levels and the low time to kill of weapons, it consistently dropped from about 64 to 12 players within 5 minutes. I can appreciate the fast pace and ease of which getting into a new match is part of the appeal for this kind of thing, but here I feel it's just been poorly implemented and needs a dedicated map pool. The latter of these 2, Horde mode, is you against growing waves of enemies, the difficulty of which slowly ramping up along with a variety of opponents you'll encounter. Earning gold so you can hopefully buy better equipment and resupply ammunition for your ranged weapons. Unfortunately, I have more than a few problems with this. The first of which being just how long it takes for things to get going. Throwing just 4 or maybe 5 enemies at you in the first wave, despite potentially having 6 or more players in the server at a time, makes it excruciatingly slow at first. There's a 20-second connection timer so people can finish loading. Then another 30 seconds where it lets you run around to hopefully grab a weapon that you can afford for just 20 gold or less. Then another 20 seconds between each wave, and the waves themselves are very small and don't actually give you that much money. So it feels like it takes at least 10 minutes before the game mode actually starts and you get a halfway decent weapon like a scythe. Secondly, the AI itself is pretty much brain dead. They'll just aggro to the nearest player and never do anything at all complex like backing up for proper spacing. Instead, depending on the kind of enemy that you're facing, they'll occasionally parry or maybe chamber your attacks if you don't bait them out. They also suffer from poor pathing, either getting stuck indoors, standing around someplace, or crowding around inside of buildings and just refuse to attack because they don't know what to do. They're unable to climb ladders, so instead they'll throw turds at you when they determine you're in an out-of-bounds area. This is all well and good until you get to the problem that it's just arbitrary what they consider out of bounds. So they interpret 2 of their mates standing in front of them makes you unreachable, so you'll then have 5 blokes throwing dung at you, killing you instantly. They can do this infinitely, by the way, and this ties in with the fact that having perfect accuracy with ranged weapons, leading to getting pelted by throwing knives for 20 plus damage a hit, while you're just trying to avoid getting mobbed by melee guys. Shields are borderline retarded and will sometimes do nothing but block forever, meaning that the most effective way of dealing with them is just kicking them endlessly until they finally die. Finally, matches can take upwards of 2 hours to complete, and you only receive gold and experience when you play to completion, so that means if you disconnect for any reason whatsoever, you're not being rewarded for your time. Which is just absurd. It lacks any and all of the options something like Killing Floor has, where there you can customize things like the difficulty, the length of matches, so short, medium, long, and whether or not you want ranged enemies, for example. It needs to give more choice to the players, and as it is, comes across as a tacked on addition that was just rushed out to add on at the last minute. It has potential, but in its current state, Horde just isn't fun, and usually ends up in what feels like a cheap or unfair death. The other 3 game modes are flavors of deathmatch, regular, team, and skirmish, the last of which is just team deathmatch, but you only get 1 life per round. Since there's a server browser, there's plenty of player-ran games that include things like dueling servers, which if you actually want to practice is probably your best bet, since the only alternative is offline versus bots, which aren't particularly good and don't give any gold or experience. Plus, you'll likely go unharassed by Randy J's running up and trying to double team you constantly. I feel as if the lack of maps is what most plagues this game. There's only 7 in total, and 3 of them are tiny 1 or 2 rooms that are restricted to deathmatch. Then there are the other 4, which are slightly larger, but not exactly big. The gore's a fun addition, and it helps liven things up when you decapitate someone or lob off some bloke's limbs, but having it on can make distinguishing between teams a bit difficult, since sooner or later everyone's going to start looking like they belong to the red side. I give Mordhau points for being generally rather pretty to look at, although it can have some load time issues. Even with my SSD, it'd still chug at startup in the menu for a good 5 seconds or so at a time. Otherwise, it runs rather well, with no crashes at release being rather commendable, at least on my part. The sounds of battle are authentic and immersive, whilst the soundtrack is totally forgettable and I end up turning it off so that I can more easily hear flanking enemies more often than not. Supposedly, it'll be coming out with modding support tools sometime in the future, which I hope will alleviate the desperate need for more maps and game modes. Ultimately, I find Mordhau is a fun game with an engaging combat system that just has a few issues that need sorting out. It plays like Chivalry, draws influence from Mountain Blade, and considers itself a competitor to For Honor. As a result, it plays like a mix of all 3, whilst comparatively lacking the polish of any of them. It has an insultingly small selection of maps, an embarrassingly short battle royale, and a lackluster horde mode. Frontline is perhaps the saving grace though, since it's just so much fun, as are their custom dueling servers, and the fighting itself is good enough that it helps outshine all of its imperfections. So I can definitely recommend it if that's what you care about. Given time, I'm sure it'll be even better, but otherwise, waiting a couple of months for more content to be released is entirely understandable. For most fans of the genre, it'll likely be addictive enough to tide them over anyway. When's Battlelord coming out?